Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today we're looking at the third scene from the prologue of Reaper's Gale, Book 7 of Steven Erikson's Malazan Book of the Fallen. Now, this is a very short scene, and it's one of those ones that's easy to sort of go, oh, well, it's about Kilmandaros meeting Anomander Rake. Yeah, it done, dusted, I got the gist of it. They're going to go and do something. And that is essentially the narrative event of it. But how it's being relayed to us, what we're being told in it, what we're being shown, and how we're being shown this actually reveals a great deal more information. So one of the first things to note about this is, again, so this is a continuous sequence of things with Kilmandaros as the central figure linking these three scenes in a row. The first, second, and third scene all figure Kilmandaros in a chronological sequence involving her transition through these things from Starville Demolane and talking about the dragons there. But she starts off in Curled Emerlan, moves to the Kachin Chamal domain, and now is going back to Curled Emerlan. So we have this sort of transition as she moves, and that's what we've been tracking. This relatively new goddess that we had heard about before, had been name dropped before, but now we're actually finding out about her and her relationship to others. And that's where we get a lot of the information about characters in the Malazan Book of the Fallen comes from the characters interacting with other characters. We don't get huge, generally, actually that's not fair. We don't generally get huge amounts of information about a character all laid out for us. Sometimes we do. Sometimes when we're with a character perspective, we get inside their head, we get details about who they are, but quite often it's how other people perceive them and how they act and interact with and around others. So the thing that I think is very interesting here is it's clear that Kilmandaros in the first one doesn't like dragons. Not a big fan of dragons, punches dragons. So we get that she doesn't really like dragons. In the second scene, we see that she doesn't like the Jagat. She doesn't like other elder gods. She's generally grumpy and a little bit violent. And certainly there's that strange juxtaposition of both being incredibly graceful, because we heard this about her movement. Because of these extra joints, she flows as she moves, and she moves a lot faster and smoother than one would expect of someone of her size, because she's ginormous, she's huge, she has giant thighs like tree trunks, these big, brutal, long arms, that everything about her should suggest being ponderous, being slow moving, being your stereotypical sort of giant troll and being stupid. But what we actually see is she is far more powerful, and we underestimate her because we see her as the dumb brute when clearly she is not. And it's a wonderful little thing that is developed over the course of these three linked prologue scenes, is that this idea that the superficial reality of someone, their external appearance, does not necessarily reflect who they are. We often misjudge people. We judge a book by its cover and not its contents. And from that perspective, Kilmandaros shows us why we shouldn't do it, because judging her from her appearance would make us completely misjudge who she is. So I think that is something that is very interesting here. The second thing that sort of comes up with this particular sequence is, again, in the first sequence, because of the extra joints, there was a suggestion of the Forkal Assail. In the second scene, there is a reference made by Gothos to her children, who again seem to be the Forkal Assail. And here she's meeting up with Anomander Rake. And she isn't concerned about her children. And why I think this is interesting and why I've brought it up is obviously one of the big things about the Teist Andi as a race is that their goddess, Mother Dark, turned her back on the Teist. And in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, we don't know why she did that. We have no idea why. But here we have another goddess figure, another female god, who seems slightly ambivalent toward what her children are doing. We see this lack of care about the race associated with those gods. We have seen Male not particularly concerned about his followers. And we have this consolidation and this point of connection in some ways, in some respects, between the Forcolocale and the Teist Andi, because their gods do not really care about them, do not seem to care about them, I should say. But this goes to a greater point about the tensions that I'd highlighted earlier between the divine and the mortal. That this is not the relationship of parent and child. Although the Teist refer to Mother Dark, she is not some stereotypical or archetypical mother figure. That's her title. But the relationship is not one of a mother loving her children. Kilmanderos is again another example of this, where she is not a stereotypical or archetypical mother figure loving her children. Male is not the stereotypical representation of a father figure loving his children. Rake, explicitly in this sequence, when asked why he didn't really care about trying to kill Scabandari Bloodeye for killing his brother, is pretty nonplussed about it. He doesn't really care. He made a calculation that Male, Kilmanderos, and Gothos were more than adequate to deal with Scabandari Bloodeye. He didn't need to be involved. And this goes to something that is quite revealing about Rake, at least I feel, in that when we have seen Rake in Gardens of the Moon and in Memories of Ice, Rake, while alien, does come across as someone who cares, someone who has feelings, someone who wants to do the right thing. That's how he seems to come across. He wants to protect Peel against the Malazan aggression because it is a good cause, and it's the sort of thing that he can rally the Teist Andi to do to get them out of their ennui, to invigorate them, to remove their lethargy. He moves them to defend Darujistan for exactly the same reason. He's allied with Kaladin Brood to give the Teist a reason to carry on living. He works in service to his people. He talks and treats with Baruch and Krupp, and he isn't disdainful of them. He befriends Whiskey Jack. He's kind of approachable. Now, he is still different. He is still not your average Joe who you're going to meet down the pub for a pint of beer. Like, he's not that character. He is different. He is slightly aloof. He is removed from the general mortal sphere. But in some ways, he is approachable, and there are points of connection. But here, he comes across as startlingly cold and calculating. And if we think back to the Midnight Tides prologue, where we got Scabandari's point of view and the discussion of how Scabandari was so draconic and that sort of reptilian aspect. And we had the same thing for Silkus Ruin. Again, these very cold, cruel, calculating decisions that these characters were making. They were brutal warriors and quite cold in what they're doing, very reptilian in what they're doing, very draconic in what they are doing. And one of the things that we see here is that Kilmanderos emphasizes that Rake is soul taken. Rake is a dragon. He is not fully Teist. And why this is interesting is because this is so far back in time, It emphasizes the change that a character can go through over time, over their character arc, over their hero's journey. And while we have not been witness to Rake's hero's journey, we've gotten little drips and drabs, little breadcrumbs about what Rake has been up to for the last 300,000 years. We know that he has fathered children. We know that he has gone on adventures. We know that he has quested all over the place, that he has done all of these different things. All of these have been hinted at, or little tales dropped about Rake appearing here or there, but we've never seen it. And now, in order to try and give us that understanding of how much he has actually changed, Erikson actually shows us him 300,000 years ago, when he is cold, when he is draconic, when he is like his brother. And this is a startling, in some ways, it is a startling contrast to how we think of Rake and what we think of Rake. He seems quite different here. And when we then think of Rake now in comparison to Kilmanderos, where we see her as very brutal, as very bestial, as very monstrous, Rake doesn't seem that different to her. And so it places in context this idea that, yes, these are incredibly long-lived and incredibly powerful beings, but what we see here is not necessarily what they will be like in the contemporary setting of the main events of the Malazan Book of the Fallen. That there is an opportunity that these people will change, but this is part of their past. And as one of the themes that keeps cropping up again and again is the past has a direct implication and impact on the present, that the two are not as separate as we sometimes think. Now, one of the things that's interesting here is Kilmanderos has just come from an exchange with Gothos, where Gothos made a deal with her, she made a deal with Gothos, and Gothos basically, tricked her. And here she walks up to Anomander Rake, and Rake offers to help. And Kilmanderos's response is, my trust is not easily earned. And you think, like, why would she say that to Rake? And you go, because about 5 minutes ago, Gothos just got the better of her, just basically put one over on her. And so you can understand why she's a little standoffish. And then we think, she hates dragons. She's not fond of dragons. She's just punched one soul-taken Teist in the head. And now here's another one coming up and saying, oh, hey, do you want to go and do this? She's overcoming a bias that she already has. And so by putting this in context, we can see why she's wary of Rake. And it's this fascinating little insight into Kilmanderos's character that makes her seem that much more relatable. She's just been tricked by someone in a bargain, and also has been going around killing a bunch of dragons, and now someone else who is also a dragon wants to offer her a deal. This is exactly why she's a bit wary. And it just, as soon as you realize that, you go, yeah, it makes perfect sense. It has not necessarily anything to do with who Rake is as a person, but just the experiences of the last few minutes, the last couple of pages that we have read, show you that, yes, that is a very natural reaction for her to have. So one of the things that I find interesting here is Anomander is very dismissive of Osiric and calls him an idiot. And again, this type of behavior, this type of tone from Rake doesn't generally, in the books, call people an idiot. This seems much more cocky, much more arrogant. So it's just highlighting that difference between early young Rake and the Rake that we have come to know over the course of the books. And when I was talking to Philip Chase about this, the thing that I have in my head that lets this make sense is Rake, as we know from the series, people are become soul taken. There is a ritual to become soul taken or divers. They acquire this power. And this suggests to me then that Rake and Silkus Ruin and Scavendary Blood Eye and all of these Teist Soul Taken are newly or relatively newly made into Soul Taken Elend. That they have become draconic, and this is a new thing for them. And what it then further suggests is that this draconic element overrides part of who they are. It is an alien thought process. It is an alien way of thinking and feeling, that this ability to turn into a dragon has repercussions for them when they're in their normal form. It's not just an ability, oh, I can turn into a dragon and fly away. It actually has repercussions for who they are as people, how they think, and they have to become accustomed to it. And there's a really interesting philosophical thought experiment. What is it like to be a bat? Which is when the basic thread, there's a whole complicated aspect to it. But essentially, in order to think like a bat, you would have to have the shape of a bat, and you would have to be a bat, in which case then you can't really think like a human anymore, because you have to think like a bat in order to understand a bat. It's a whole philosophical thing. It's a fascinating little thought experiment. It's a great little article, if you can find it. But this is an aspect that I find so fascinating about the Soul Taken and the Divers here, and why it's not just a power to do these things, but it has an impact on character. And when we think back to that sequence about the Path of Hands and Deadhouse Gates, when we see those Soul Taken and those Divers, when we see how they interact with other people and how they treat other people, it suddenly makes a lot more sense that even though they began as some sort of human who could do this, or humanoid who could do this, that the monstrosity of what they turn into can alter who they are. And it actually makes the death of those Soul Taken who were good all the more distressing and all the more impactful, because we realize how rare it is not to be overtaken by the monstrosity. So I think that is an interesting point that sort of comes across in this prologue. Now, another thing that sort of comes across here is in the previous one where Gothos had made the Finnest to capture Scavendary's essence, and we know that Scavendary had deposited Silkus Ruin in an Azath house. We're getting these points of connection between the Finnest being a seed to grow an Azath, which we saw in Gardens of the Moon. But we've also seen that the Azath, while they can imprison people, have guardians, and they have people can escape the imprisonment. We've already seen that happen. And it appears that Anomander knows this. Anomander understands this. And he thinks that Silkus, although he was betrayed and killed by Scavendary, he's going to end up in an Azath for a while. And you know what? That might do him some good. It sounds cold. It sounds calculating. I don't know if you've ever had a brother. Sometimes you feel that way. But this shows that level of calculation, this draconic nature that I was just talking about. But it also illustrates further and expands further on those concepts of the Azath, this great mystery running through the Malazan Book of the Fallen so far, and this link between the Finnest as a source of power, as a seed, and its point of connection to the Azath and what the Azath are doing. So all of that is again being explored. Is it overt? Is it overtly telling us these things? No, but again, this is this technique that Erikson likes to use of showing us another aspect of it, so that by combining this with all of the other scenes and discussions and descriptions of the Azath and of Finnists and our understanding of how the metaphysics and the magic system of this world operates, we get a more rounded image and concept of what is going on. We are slowly developing contextual knowledge about the world and how it functions, and we're understanding it in a way that's actually quite organic, because it's not being told to us by an omniscient narrator. We are picking it up and we are learning it as if It was something in the real world. It was something we learn about in the world around us, that we get these different perspectives and we form an opinion. So it's a really nice technique, and one that I enjoy for this. And lastly, just about this sort of point, this point between the two of them, they go to cleanse. They set about cleansing what was left of it. So they go into Curled Emerald, this shattered warren that is being torn apart by these ascendants, these gods, these interlopers who are carving out pieces of power for themselves and stealing pieces of it and trying to take it over. And Rake has said he doesn't want the throne. He doesn't want to command the warren. It's not what he's interested in. Now, as a Teist Andy, as a child of darkness, why would he want Shadow? It's perfectly understandable that he's not that interested in Shadow. But again, it is power. So even here we see Rake turning his back on claiming additional power. And that is a key aspect of his personality that we have seen before, that hasn't changed because of his nature. He doesn't want the throne of Shadow. He's not interested in the throne of Shadow. And that is a key aspect here that I think is important to recognize. But the idea of cleansing, this is something that I think ties into the brutality of Kilmanderos and how scary Rake actually can be as a character. Because when you talk about cleansing in this sense has enormous connotations of wiping people out. We've seen with Kilmanderos her monstrosity, her bestial nature, her violence, this pent-up aggression and explosive violence. With Rake, we are seeing this cold, calculated, draconic, sinister nature, at least being hinted at. But with this word cleansing, with this moving in an alliance into Curled Emerald to get rid of the interlopers, it's a cleansing, and that suggests something truly frightening. Because when we think about terms like cleansing when it comes to people, that is not a police action. It is not a simple security action. This is the extermination of people. And because Rake is so cold and calculating in this particular scene, and because Kilmanderos is so bestial and violent and monstrous in these scenes, that adds that connotation to cleansing. That makes this truly frightening and disturbing and worrying in terms of what they're about to do. And so that, I think, is because of that word choice, because then when we go back through it, we reread Rake's lines in light of this, in light of what they're about to do, and we contrast that with what he ends up doing in Gardens of the Moon and in Memories of Ice. We can see this almost as potentially the sin that Rake is running from, the sin that Rake is trying to make up for. That this is not a clean battle. This is not a war between people. This is not a contest of wills, a duel, or anything like this. It isn't even a betrayal the way that Scabandari betrayed Silkus. This is an extermination that these two incredibly powerful beings are about to enact. And that darkness, no pun intended for, Anomander Rake, but that darkness to what is going on, I think it fits with this very violent tone and undertone that we've seen to everything. This element of destruction that has been running through these passages. And this element of loss and grief and sorrow and suffering that we see as the aftermath. And when we think of those fragments of shadow that have appeared, we've seen how Drishna in The Whirlwind, Dead House Gates and House of Chains, how that is a monstrous fragment, a tortured fragment. We've seen with the tyrant, Panion, how that was actually the result of a crime in the past. We've seen how the mistreatment of people has repercussions. And so this is directly foreboding elements in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. So I thought that was very interesting. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.